Chapter 5, Part 1 of Principia Ethica. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Fredrik Karlsson. Principia Ethica by G. E. Moore. Chapter 5, Ethics in Relation to Conduct. 86. In the present chapter we have again to take a great step in ethical method. My discussion hitherto has fallen under two main heads. Under the first I try to show what good, the adjective good, means. This appeared to be the first point to be settled in any treatment of ethics that should aim at being systematic. It is necessary we should know this, should know what good means, before we can go on to consider what is good, what things or qualities are good. It is necessary we should know it for two reasons. The first reason is that good is the notion upon which all ethics depends. We cannot hope to understand what we mean when we say that this is good or that is good until we understand quite clearly not only what this is or that is, which the natural sciences and philosophy can tell us, but also what is meant by calling them good, a matter which is reserved for ethics only. Unless we are quite clear on this point, our ethical reason will be always apt to be fallacious. We shall think that we are proving that a thing is good, when we are really only proving that it is something else, since unless we know what good means, unless we know what is meant by that notion in itself as distinct from what is meant by any other notion, we shall not be able to tell when we are dealing with it and when we are dealing with something else, which is perhaps like it, but yet not the same. And the second reason why we should settle first of all this question, what good means, is a reason of method. It is this, that we can never know on what evidence an ethical proposition rests until we know the nature of the notion which makes the proposition ethical. We cannot tell what is possible, by way of proof, in favor of one judgment that this or that is good, or against another judgment that this or that is bad, until we have recognized what the nature of such propositions must always be. In fact, it follows from the meaning of good and bad that such propositions are all of them, in Kant's phrase, synthetic. They all must rest in the end upon some proposition which must be simply accepted or rejected, which cannot be logically deduced from any other proposition. This result, which follows from our first investigation, may be otherwise expressed by saying that the fundamental principles of ethics must be self-evident. But I am anxious that this expression should not be misunderstood. The expression self-evident means properly that the proposition so called is evident or true by itself alone, that it is not an inference from some proposition other than itself. The expression does not mean that the proposition is true because it is evident to you or me or all mankind, because, in other words, it appears to us to be true. That a proposition appears to be true can never be a valid argument that true it really is. By saying that a proposition is self-evident, we mean emphatically that its appearing so to us is not the reason why it is true. For we mean that it has also absolutely no reason. It would not be a self-evident proposition if we could say of it, I cannot think otherwise and therefore it is true. For then its evidence or proof would not lie in itself, but in something else, namely our conviction of it. That it appears true to us may indeed be the cause of our asserting it, or the reason why we think and say that it is true. But a reason in this sense is something utterly different from a logical reason, or reason why something is true. Moreover, it is obviously not a reason of the same thing. The evidence of a proposition to us is only a reason for our holding it to be true, whereas a logical reason, or reason in the sense in which self-evident propositions have no reason, is a reason why the proposition itself must be true, not why we hold it so to be. Again, that a proposition is evident to us may not only be the reason why we do think or affirm it, it may even be a reason why we ought to think it or affirm it. But a reason in this sense too is not a logical reason for the truth of the proposition, though it is a logical reason for the rightness of holding the proposition. In our common language, however, these three meanings of reasons are constantly confused whenever we say, I have a reason for thinking that true. But it is absolutely essential, if we are to get clear notions about ethics or indeed about any other, especially any philosophical study, that we should distinguish them. When therefore I talk of intuitionistic hedonism, I must not be understood to imply that my denial that pleasure is the only good is based on my intuition of its falsehood. My intuition of its falsehood is indeed my reason for holding and declaring it untrue. It is indeed the only valid reason for so doing. But that is just because there is no logical reason for it, because there is no proper evidence or reason of its falsehood except itself alone. It is untrue because it is untrue, and there is no other reason. But I declare it untrue because its untruth is evident to me, and I hold that that is a sufficient reason for my assertion. We must not therefore look on intuition as if it were an alternative to reasoning. Nothing whatever can take the place of reasons for the truth of any proposition. Intuition can only furnish a reason for holding any proposition to be true. This, however, it must do when any proposition is self-evident, when, in fact, there are no reasons which prove its truth. 87. So much, then, for the first step, which established that good is good and nothing else whatever, and that naturalism was a fallacy. A second step was taken when we began to consider proposed self-evident principles of ethics. In this second division, resting on our result that good means good, we began the discussion of propositions asserting that such and such a thing or quality or concept was good. Of such a kind was the principle of intuitionistic or ethical hedonism, the principle that pleasure alone is good. Following the method established by our first discussion, I claim that the untruth of this proposition was self-evident. I could do nothing to prove that it was untrue. I could only point out as clearly as possible what it means, and how it contradicts other propositions which appear to be equally true. My only object in all this was, necessarily, to convince. But even if I did convince, that does not prove that we are right. It justifies us in holding that we are so, but nevertheless we may be wrong. On one thing, however, we may justly pride ourselves. It is that we have had a better chance of answering our questions rightly than Bentham or Mill or Sidgwick or others who have contradicted us. For we have proved that these have never even asked themselves the question which they professed to answer. They have confused it with another question. Small wonder, therefore, if their answer is different from ours. We must be quite sure that the same question has been put before we trouble ourselves at the different answers that are given to it. For all we know, the whole world would agree with us if they could once clearly understand the question upon which we want their votes. Certain it is that in all those cases where we found a difference of opinion, we found also that the question had not been clearly understood. Though, therefore, we cannot prove that we are right, yet we have a reason to believe that everybody, unless he is taking as to what he thinks, will think the same as we. It is as with a sum in mathematics. If we find a gross and palpable error in the calculations, we are not surprised or troubled that the person who made this mistake has reached a different result from ours. We think he will admit that this result is wrong if his mistake is pointed out to him. For instance, if a man has to add up 5 plus 7 plus 9, we should not wonder that he made the result to be 34 if he started by making 5 plus 7 equals 25. And so in ethics, if we find, as we did, that the desirable is confused with desired, or the end is confused with means, we need not be disconcerted that those who have committed these mistakes do not agree with us. The only difference is that in ethics, owing to the intricacy of its subject matter, it is far more difficult to persuade anyone either that he has made a mistake or that that mistake affects his result. In this second division of my subject, the division which is occupied with the question, what is good in itself, I have hitherto only tried to establish one definite result, and that a negative one, namely that pleasure is not the sole good. This result, if true, refutes half, or more than half, of the ethical theories which have ever been held, and is therefore not without importance. It will, however, be necessary presently to deal positively with the question, what things are good, and in what degrees. 88. But before proceeding to this discussion, I propose first to deal with the third kind of ethical question, the question, what ought we to do? The answering of this question constitutes the third great division of ethical inquiry, and its nature was briefly explained in Chapter 1. It introduces into ethics, as was there pointed out, an entirely new question, the question what things are related as causes to that which is good in itself, and this question can only be answered by an entirely new method, the method of empirical investigation, by means of which causes are discovered in the other sciences. To ask what kind of actions we ought to perform, or what kind of conduct is right, is to ask what kind of effects such action and conduct will produce. Not a single question in practical ethics can be answered except by a causal generalization. All such questions do, indeed, also involve an ethical judgment proper, the judgment that certain effects are better in themselves than others. But they do assert that these better things are effects, are causally connected with the actions in question. Every judgment in practical ethics may be reduced to the form, this is a cause of that good thing. 89. That this is the case, that the question, what is right, what is my duty, what ought I to do, belong exclusively to this third branch of ethical inquiry, is the first point to which I wish to call attention. All moral laws, I wish to show, are merely statements that certain kinds of actions will have good effects. The very opposite of this view has been generally prevalent in ethics. The right and the useful have been supposed to be at least capable of conflicting with one another, and, at all events, to be essentially distinct. It has been characteristic of a certain school of moralists, as of moral common sense, to declare that the end will never justify the means. What I wish first to point out is that right does and can mean nothing but cause of a good result, and is thus identical with useful. Whence it follows that the end always will justify the means, and that no action which is not justified by its results can be right. That there may be a true proposition, meant to be conveyed by the assertion, the end will not justify the means, I fully admit. But that, in another sense, and a sense far more fundamental for ethical theory, it is utterly false, must first be shown. That the assertion, I am morally bound to perform this action, is identical with the assertion, this action will produce the greatest amount of good in the universe, has already been briefly shown in Chapter 1. But it is important to insist that this fundamental point is demonstrably certain. This may perhaps be best made evident in the following way. It is plain that when we assert that a certain action is our absolute duty, we are asserting that the performance of that action at that time is unique in respect of value. But no dutiful action can possibly have unique value in the sense that it is the sole thing of value in the world, since, in that case, every such action would be the sole good thing, which is a manifest contradiction. And for the same reason its value cannot be unique in the sense that it has more intrinsic value than anything else in the world, since every act of duty would then be the best thing in the world, which is also a contradiction. It can, therefore, be unique only in the sense that the whole world will be better, if it be performed, than if any possible alternative were taken. And the question whether this is so cannot possibly depend solely on the question of its own intrinsic value. For any action will always have effects different from those of any other action. And if any of these have intrinsic value, their value is exactly as relevant to the total goodness of the universe as that of their cause. It is, in fact, evident that, however valuable an action may be in itself, yet, owing to its existence, the sum of good in the universe may conceivably be made less than if some other action, less valuable in itself, had been performed. But to say that this is the case is to say that it would have been better that the action should not have been done, and this again is obviously equivalent to the statement that it ought not to have been done, that it was not what duty required. Fiat justitia ruat caelum can only be justified on the ground that by the doing of justice the universe gains more than it loses by the falling of the heavens. It is, of course, possible that this is the case, but, at all events, to assert that justice is a duty, in spite of such consequences, is to assert that it is the case. Our duty, therefore, can only be defined as that action which will cause more good to exist in the universe than any possible alternative, and what is right or morally permissible only differs from this as what will not cause less good than any possible alternative. When, therefore, ethics presumes to assert that certain ways of acting are duties, it presumes to assert that to act in those ways will always produce the greatest possible sum of good. If we are told that to do no murder is a duty, we are told that the action, whatever it may be, which is called murder, will under no circumstances cause so much good to exist in the universe as its avoidance. 90. But, if this be recognized, several most important consequences follow, with regard to the relation of ethics to conduct. 1. It is plain that no moral law is self-evident, as has commonly been held by the intuitional school of moralists. The intuitional view of ethics consists in the supposition that certain rules, stating that certain actions are always to be done or to be omitted, may be taken as self-evident premises. I have shown with regard to judgments of what is good in itself that this is the case. No reason can be given for them. But it is the essence of intuitionism to suppose that rules of action, statements not of what ought to be, but of what we ought to do, are in the same sense intuitively certain. Plausibility has been lent to this view by the fact that we do undoubtedly make immediate judgment that certain actions are obligatory or wrong. We are thus often intuitively certain of our duty, in a psychological sense. But nevertheless these judgments are not self-evident and cannot be taken as ethical premises, since, as has now been shown, they are capable of being confirmed or refuted by an investigation of causes and effects. It is indeed possible that some of our immediate intuitions are true, but since what we intuit, what conscience tells us, is that certain actions will always produce the greatest sum of good possible under the circumstances, it is plain that reasons can be given which will show the deliverance of conscience to be true or false. 91. 2. In order to show that any action is a duty, it is necessary to know both what are the other conditions which will, conjointly with it, determine its effects, to know exactly what will be the effects of these conditions, and to know all the events which will be in any way affected by our action throughout an infinite future. We must have all this causal knowledge, and further we must know accurately the degree of value both of the action itself and of all these effects, and must be able to determine how, in conjunction with the other things in the universe, they will affect its value as an organic whole. And not only this, we must also possess all this knowledge with regard to the effects of every possible alternative, and must then be able to see by comparison that the total value due to the existence of the action in question will be greater. But it is obvious that our causal knowledge alone is far too incomplete for us ever to assure ourselves of this result, that an action is our duty. We can never be sure that any action will produce the greatest value possible. Ethics, therefore, is quite unable to give us a list of duties, but there still remains a humbler task which may be possible for practical ethics. Although we cannot hope to discover which, in a given situation, is the best of all possible alternative actions, there may be some possibility of showing which among the alternatives, likely to occur to anyone, will produce the greatest sum of good. This second task is certainly all that ethics can ever have accomplished, and it is certainly all that it has ever collected materials for proving, since no one has ever attempted to exhaust the possible alternative actions in any particular case. Ethical philosophers have in fact confined their attention to a very limited class of actions, which have been selected because they are those which most commonly occur to mankind as possible alternatives. With regard to these, they may possibly have shown that any alternative is better, that is, produces a greater total of value than others. But it seems desirable to insist that though they have represented this result as a determination of duties, it can never really have been so. For the term duty is certainly so used that, if we are subsequently persuaded that any possible action would have produced more good than the one we adopted, we admit that we failed to do our duty. It will, however, be a useful task if ethics can determine which among alternatives likely to occur will produce the greatest total value. For though this alternative cannot be proved to be the best possible, yet it may be better than any course of action which we should otherwise adopt. 92. A difficulty in distinguishing this task, which ethics may perhaps undertake with some hope of success, from the hopeless task of finding duties, arises from an ambiguity in the use of the term possible. An action may, in one perfectly legitimate sense, be said to be impossible solely because the idea of doing it does not occur to us. In this sense, then, the alternatives which do actually occur to a man would be the only possible alternatives, and the best of these would be the best possible action under the circumstances, and hence would conform to our definition of duty. But when we talk of the best possible action as our duty, we mean by the term any action which no other known circumstance would prevent, provided the idea of it occur to us. And this use of the term is in accordance with popular usage. For we admit that a man may fail to do his duty through neglecting to think of what he might have done. Since therefore we say that he might have done what nevertheless did not occur to him, it is plain that we do not limit his possible actions to those of which he thinks. It might be urged, with more plausibility, that we mean by a man's duty only the best of those actions of which he might have thought. And it is true that we do not blame any man very severely for omitting an action which, as we say, he could not be expected to think. But even here it is plain that we recognize a distinction between what he might have done and what he might have thought of doing. We regard it as a pity that he did not do otherwise, and duty is certainly used in such a sense, that it would be a contradiction in terms to say that it was a pity that a man did his duty. We must therefore distinguish a possible action from an action of which it is possible to think. By the former we mean an action which no known cause would prevent, provided the idea of it occurred to us, and that one among such actions which will produce the greatest total good is what we mean by duty. Ethics certainly cannot hope to discover what kind of action is always our duty in this sense. It may, however, hope to decide which among one or two such possible actions is the best. And those which it has chosen to consider are, as a matter of fact, the most important of those with regard to which men deliberate whether they shall or shall not do them. A decision with regard to these may therefore be easily confounded with a decision with regard to which is the best possible action. But it is to be noted that even though we shall limit ourselves to considering which is the better among alternatives likely to be thought of, the fact that these alternatives might be thought of is not included in what we mean by calling them possible alternatives. Even if in any particular case it was impossible that the idea of them should have occurred to a man, the question we are concerned with is, which, if it had occurred, would have been the best alternative. If we say that murder is always a worse alternative, we mean to assert that it is so, even where it is impossible for the murderer to think of doing anything else. The utmost, then, that practical ethics can hope to discover is which, among a few alternatives possible under certain circumstances, will, on the whole, produce the best result. It may tell us which is the best, in this sense, of certain alternatives about which we are likely to deliberate, and since we may also know that, even if we choose none of these, what we shall, in that case, do is unlikely to be as good as one of them, it may thus tell us which of the alternatives, among which we can choose, it is best to choose. If it could do this, it would be sufficient for practical guidance. End of chapter 5, part 1.